Are you wondering what seller concessions are and how it can help you as a buyer or even as a seller in this current market? If so, then this video is for you. Now, in this video, we'll go over what seller concessions are, what they cover, who they benefit, advantages and disadvantages, how to negotiate a concession, any limitations to seller concessions, and finally, the most frequently asked questions. Now, I've made it easy to skip to any of the topics covered in this video, and you can find that in the description below. Also, please remember to smash the like and subscribe button to be kept up to date with more tips on buying or selling your home. Okay, let's get into it. Now, before we define what seller concessions are, it's important we quickly go over closing costs. When buying a house, you're going to pay closing costs and fees to cover the cost of getting a mortgage. Closing costs usually range from 3 to 6% of the home price. In some cases, you may be able to get the seller to pay for some of these closing costs. These are called seller concessions, and they can be a powerful way to save you closing costs. Now, before you go close your mortgage, consider learning how to use seller concessions to your advantage. Now that we have a basic understanding of closing costs, we can identify what seller concessions are. Now, seller concessions are closing costs that the seller has agreed to pay. Sometimes you can ask the seller to contribute to specific closing costs. Other times, sellers may simply pay a percentage of the total closing costs. Now you're probably asking yourself what closing costs a seller concession can cover. The seller may be able to cover part or all of the following closing costs: property taxes, title insurance, loan origination fees, inspection fees, recording fees, appraisal fees, attorney fees, and finally, points, also known as discount points. These are upfront interest you pay to reduce your interest rate. For this last point, in the current state of the housing market, seller concessions are highly leveraged against bringing down the interest rate. An example is using it on a buy-down program. In a buy-down program option, the seller will make a one-time payment and deposit it into an escrow account or pay for points over the entire loan term as part of the seller concession. This payment or subsidy provides a lender with the funds necessary to lower the buyer's interest rate so that the buyer can more easily afford a home loan. However, to make up for this expense, especially in the seller's market, the seller will often add the cost of the subsidy to the purchase price of the home. Now, before you start thinking, which one of these costs should I cover with the concession? Consider talking with a lender and apply for a loan. The lender will give you a loan estimate, which shows you all of the estimated closing costs. You can then work with the real estate agent to decide how best to use a potential seller concession. Now that we've defined what seller concessions are and how they can be used, let's discuss who benefits from seller concessions. With a name like seller concessions, you might think that it only benefits the buyer. However, seller concessions can help both the buyer and the seller. For the seller, offering concessions can make their home more attractive to potential buyers, especially in a buyer's market. Seller concessions can help the buyer who doesn't have the cash on hand to cover their closing costs. Now, first-time home buyers often underestimate the costs associated with buying a home. So, seller concessions are a way to help offset some of those costs and make the home more affordable. Let's go over the advantages and disadvantages of seller concessions. For buyers, there are both pros and cons to asking for seller concessions. Before you make your decision one way or the other, it's important to make sure you fully understand what it is you're asking for and how it could cost you. One of the advantages of seller concessions is that it allows you to pay less for closing costs to make buying the home more affordable. As a buyer, you usually have to bring at least a few $1,000s to the table for closing costs and your down payment. Seller concessions can cut these costs significantly, so you don't have to completely empty your savings to buy a home. Agreeing to seller concessions can be good for the seller in some circumstances. For example, they can help the seller get their home off the market faster. If the seller is eager to sell their home, they may be willing to pay part of the buyer's closing costs to speed up the process. On the flip side, a disadvantage of a seller concession is asking for a concession might make you a less appealing buyer. Most sellers are looking for offers that don't have a lot of strings attached, especially in a seller's market. If a home has multiple bids, the seller will probably disregard offers that include concession requests. In this instance, it might be better to put in a lower offer for the home and cover the closing costs yourself. This option is easier for the seller and may increase the chance your offer will get accepted. Again, the current market we are in favors the buyers, so the disadvantage would not be as pronounced. Now that we've gone over advantages and disadvantages, let's cover how to negotiate the seller concession. So, you know you want to ask for a concession, but how do you convince a seller to help you pay? Asking for concessions is all about negotiating and understanding the current housing market. First, you need to figure out whether you're in a buyer's market or a seller's market. This will heavily influence your ability to negotiate for concessions. Sellers are much more motivated to offer concessions when their homes have been sitting on the market for a while or when it's a buyer's market. If you decide to ask for concessions, limit your other demands. Sellers like to take the offer that's the least complicated for them. If you ask for concessions as well as repairs, replacements, and services, the seller's more likely to pass up on your offer. If repairs aren't absolute for you, consider offering a lower price and covering the closing costs yourself. If you know you want to ask for concessions, we recommend working with a real estate agent. Your real estate agent can research local sales and tell you about your area's housing market. They can also find similar properties that were sold with concessions. Presenting examples of recent seller concessions can help motivate your seller to work with you on closing costs. Ultimately, your real estate agent can help you decide whether you should ask for closing costs or put in a lower offer. If you need a referral to a local real estate professional, connect with me. I'm part of a large network of real estate professionals that are leaders in your local market. I would be happy to refer you to one. My contact details are in the description below. Now that you have an idea of how to negotiate seller concessions, let's cover what limits there are to seller concessions. Your seller can't pay all your closing costs. How much your seller can pay depends on the type of loan you're getting and other factors. Keep in mind that the total amount the seller can contribute can exceed your total closing costs. For example, let's say you buy a home that's worth $200,000 with a conventional loan and a 20% down payment, and you end up with a $160,000 mortgage. Using the average closing cost of 6%, the seller could legally contribute $9,600. But if your closing costs for this mortgage are only $5,000, the seller can give you more than $5,000 in seller concessions. Now you're probably wondering, why are there limits to seller concessions? Well, mortgage rulemakers like Fannie Mae and HUD set limits on seller concessions to discourage the inflation in the housing market. For example, let's say you want to buy a house that's worth $150,000, and that seller offers you to buy that house for $175,000. They offer you those extra $25,000 for closing costs and tell you to keep anything that's left over. Even though that might sound like a good deal for you, it can cause local housing prices to rise. When other sellers and agents see what the house sold for, the prices of other homes will go up to match the inflated market value. This cycle can quickly cause home and rent prices to rise to unsustainable levels. To avoid this, sellers are only allowed to contribute a small percentage of their home's value to closing costs. The limitation for seller concessions also extend to limits by loan type. Now, before we go over those loan types, I should mention that there are restrictions to appraised price as well. So the lesser the sales price or the appraised value usually dictates how much your seller can pay in concessions. For example, say you offer $155,000 for a home. That home appraises for $150,000. The seller concessions max out at 3%, so the seller can only contribute up to 3% of $150,000, the appraised value, or $4,500 to help with closing costs. Now, here are the seller concession limits for some common loans. For conventional loans, the limits depend on how much you're putting down. If your down payment is less than 10%, the seller can contribute up to 3%. If your down payment is 10 to 25%, the seller can contribute up to 6%. If your down payment is more than 25%, the seller can contribute up to 9%. If you're buying an investment property, the seller's contribution is limited to 2% no matter what your down payment is. For FHA loans, the seller can contribute up to 6%. On USDA loans, the sellers can contribute up to 6% of the buyer's loan amount. This is the one loan type where the seller concessions are not based on the home price or appraised value. Finally, VA loans. Rules dictate that the seller can contribute up to 4%. Seller concessions on VA loans may include payments towards the buyer's judgment and debts, as well as VA funding fees. Now that we've covered the limitations, let's discuss some of the most frequently asked questions about seller concessions. Are seller concessions common? Seller concessions are pretty common, though they occur more in a buyer's market than in a seller's market. Can sellers refuse to contribute towards my closing costs? Sellers do not have to contribute to closing costs. Any seller concessions must be negotiated into your contract. Are sellers' concessions paid out of pocket? Seller concessions come out of the seller's profit for the sale, so they are not directly paid by the seller out of pocket. Are the seller concessions taxable? Seller concessions are considered to be sales expenses and are therefore tax deductible. Consult your tax professional for more on this. Is it better to ask for seller concessions or a lower sales price? It depends on your situation. If you are looking to have closing costs that are as low as possible, then seller concessions are the best option for you. Here's the bottom line. Seller concessions are closing costs that the seller agrees to pay. They can make a home more affordable for the buyer, and they can help the seller close the deal. Work with your real estate agent to decide whether this is a good opportunity for you to ask the seller for concessions. If the market is right, you might be able to ask the seller to pay for part or all of your closing costs. You just have to make sure what you're asking for is within the limits dictated by the type of the loan you're getting. Before you can think about seller concessions, you need to find a property and have your offer accepted. If you're ready to find your new home and are wondering what the process looks like, check out my other video titled How to Buy a Home in 10 Steps. And finally, do me a favor. If you've made it this far and you found this content useful, please remember to smash that like button and subscribe to my channel for more content. Thanks for watching.